Thank you very much, Francesca, and of course thanks for inviting us here and hosting this presentation. And more than anything, thanks for the opportunity for us to talk about this academy and the potential which I think it has for significant impact in various fields of knowledge production. Throughout the morning we're going to have some practical talks and descriptions of activities and coincidences between artists and scientists, which I think will help to illustrate some of the things that I wanted to say initially. And we'll describe some of the activities of the Academy, but I wanted to begin by just sort of contextualising something about the idea of an academy within a contemporary knowledge production environment. This is something which has always been at the forefront of our thinking about what the academy could be, but that's not without its difficulties and problems in terms of establishing how that could come into being, what one might do, and so on. What I'd like to do this morning is begin the session by talking a little bit about two types of approach. The title of the session is about the practice of transdisciplinarity. I'm going to say something about Helga Novotny's writings and theories about transdisciplinarity. And I'm also going to refer to Bruno Latour, who of course has done an enormous amount of sociological work into the practice of science and defined various theories about how science might be described, how it's produced, and so on and so forth, to hopefully identify a fertile ground for the Academy to operate within. So I'd like to maybe begin by saying something about Latour's approach. I'm sure quite a number of you are familiar with his proposition of a description of sociology and science, which is referred to as the actor network theory. And in a sense, I'm finding that my particular actor here, which is going back to old school notes rather than relying on PowerPoint that I'm usually doing, is causing all sorts of difficulties. I'm not sure which way around this paper works. Latour set out to try and analyse science practice and looked at, followed, studied and analysed activities that generate science. Research labs, universities, funding, so on and so forth. And also technologies, machineries, measuring equipment and everything that contributes towards the production of science. His theory defines two major constituents. One is the actors, those are the things which have a potential to act in some way, and the other is the way in which they're connected together to form what he refers to as corporate bodies, things which produce science. It seems to me a very good model to look at both science and art practice, and although we often hear about this distinction between science and art, it's my experience that a number of the actors in both realms are shared and are in common, and in part that's what we're focusing on with the Academy. Latour set out to try and find an alternative to the opposition between the realist approaches and the relativist approaches, which, you know, in a sense both consider the self as an isolated brain. Latour refers to it as the brain in a vat, and that's distinct from the outside world and the things which we perceive. And whilst both a relativist and a realist might accept that, their solution to what bridges the gap between the brain in the vat and the outside world are quite different. A realist might say that science is the gap to understanding the outside world for humans, and realists would probably say that science is simply just another language game, another way of manipulating language, which crosses the gap. Latour elegantly just says there is no gap, and that's the end of that. So what happens, if there is no gap? It means that the complexity of the environment in which knowledge is created or generated has to be analysed. And these actors that he specifies are everything to do with the production of knowledge and the implementation of science, and I would also say artist practice as well. Not only is an actor a person, potentially, but it's also an institution, it's also potentially a technology, and this is where the idea of non-humans come into the equation. But Latour's very conscious about saying that the non-human actors within this whole network of potential are very significant and important in making things happen, making environments, creating environments for new knowledge to be discovered. Actors quite often have what he describes as sub-programs. That's to say, a series of potential things that they can do, which they facilitate, which are not necessarily to do with their design. Technology is a really good example of this, and I come across examples all the time, particularly in my field of sort of experimental electronic music. You know, there's one great piece of evidence from DJ Pierre, who's the guy who invented acid house, which was his description of the evolution of that form of music, and done that form of music, which was simply by taking a piece of commercial technology, the Roland 303, and finding something else it can do, without any understanding of what it was, not viewing it as a tool to implement a metaphorical idea, but simply messing about with it. And focusing in on a particular aesthetic outcome and sticking with that. It's very interesting talking to Phil Lobel, who will be speaking later about bioacoustics, that he also describes a really interesting example of this sort of sub-program understanding, which is when the camcorders were developed for underwater. It's very simple, off-the-shelf, cheap camcorders for people to go on holiday with and take photographs. Actually transformed the way he did science, because for the first time you could get a portable, cheap system that would get right up close to fish, record the sound, take a photograph on, so the scientists knew exactly what they were doing. Whereas before, they'd not been able to link up photographs and sounds and images. So that's a technology actor that gets employed in the network that forms a new possibility, a new potential. And this is what's exciting about the way that one might view all of these different actors. Now, networks are more complex than just the practical networks of realising both science and art, and of course they extend to institutional structures. And you know, we're all familiar, I think most of the academics in this room are familiar with the effort and the time that it takes to negotiate a network of deans, of grant funding, 2-year application processes, peer reviews, publications and so on, which are part of the network, which actually is the only way in which big science can be facilitated in the current environment. You know, all corporate bodies, as Latour defines them, have these structures in place: funders, interested parties, politics, and so on, which are brought to bear on the actual production of knowledge, and of course influence how it's produced and what the outcomes of that knowledge are. It's become increasingly obvious to me that particularly in the audio sphere, where I primarily work, the actors, the technological actors that are shared between artistic practice and science practice are the same. The technologies, the audio technologies, the software processes that are used are in common. Research is going on independently in both spheres, but it's rare that they actually come together to form something that can potentially take forward and develop new areas of practice. So this is something that I've certainly been interested to try and facilitate with the academy. I'll move quickly onto, I suppose I don't want to take too much time, onto the notion of transdisciplinarity, just to really put some meat on the bones in terms of describing what Elgar Novotny, who's currently the president of the European Research Council, said in 2003 in a paper which is called The Potential of Transdisciplinarity. The idea in the first instance is that a lot of knowledge occurs that's not categorized by traditional disciplines. And it's not multidisciplinary, it's not a combination of disciplines, it's fundamentally not part of a discipline, it's in between. But more importantly than that, the notion of transdisciplinarity is about transgression. The idea that knowledge is transgressive and moves not only between institutions, but seeps out of institutions. Institutions, like universities, are no longer the sole holders of knowledge. We know this because of our experience of technology. And we know that information passes quite freely around between institutional structures and societal structures and organisations. But the practice and model of science quite often is still restricted within older institutional frameworks, and it's very difficult to engage with this. Science always speaks to society. You know, the idea that science and society are separate things is problematic. Transdisciplinarity, in part, is about negotiating the way in which science is integrated as everything else within our societies. So Novotny says a number of things about transdisciplinarity, but primarily she defines it as generating a different type of knowledge, which she calls mode 2 knowledge, which is distinct from what we might call mode 1 knowledge, which is more traditional science practice in laboratories that's about supporting scientific development in a pure sense. She presents this idea from a perspective of observation, of actually looking at what research organisations and researchers do. And she identifies that a huge amount of contemporary research is carried out in the context of application. That's to say, it's not purely done for the sake of biology or physics, but it's done because there is a problem that has to be solved and looked at. And inherently, she observes, that requires the dialogue of a very large number of actors and participants, which takes some time to establish how one might move forward in that area. Simply because of the complexity of the actors and the networks to which they belong. She also identifies that because one uses multiple actors who all have different skills, quite diverse skills quite often, organisational structures such as those found in universities or in traditional science development, for example, funding systems and so on, are not necessarily appropriate to support that type of work, and in fact legislate against it in many cases, and that a flat hierarchy, more open-ended structures are really required to facilitate how one might go forward with transdisciplinary activity. And to re-emphasise that transdisciplinarity is more about transgression than it is about this in-betweenness of things. And as an example of transgression, Novotny articulates this by talking a lot about governmental structures and the fact that the roles of NGOs and so on come in to have quite a significant impact on social reality, more than the nation state of old. We know there's a much more plural sort of existence within those different types of things. There are various issues to do with accountability and quality control, which she also identifies. I won't go into too much detail, but simply to say that in terms of quality, people often say when you combine different disciplines or you operate in transdisciplinary, you water down, you lessen the impact, and she really refutes that and just says it's a different thing. It's not the same thing. The sort of production, knowledge production, is a different type of knowledge production, more related to the sort of value added or value integrated role of society and stakeholders in research. But accountability is a very important thing, not simply in terms of what an individual is accountable for their actions, but the accountability of science to society and also to interested parties. For example, like conservation groups, like interested and relevant community groups. And those within this mode 2 knowledge production are a very important part of the science, the idea of doing science or doing transdisciplinary work. So it's about transgressing boundaries between science, and it's about transgressing boundaries between institutions. And a lot of important and significant things seem to have arisen from the implementation of this practice, including the fact that engineers find that better solutions are discovered not from the traditional context that they're isolated practice in the lab, but by integrating more groups, feedback groups, and pressure groups, and so on, into the design of research and the context of research. The long and short of this is that within arts practice and science practice, we think there's a very fertile ground for collaboration, and the academy can be potentially the most important piece in the jigsaw to bring together these disparate networks. I've described a little bit about the network of the corporate body that exists within science and university and academic activity. Similarly, within artistic practice, there's another corporate body and another network which really don't fit together. The aligning of that requires something to go in the middle, and what we hope is the Academy is that, by providing certain types of actors, both in terms of the technologies, methods that are available within the Academy, certain types of expertise to form these links, certain alternative approaches to funding, alternative presentation, and of course an integration with wider societal groups within the definition of what activity is going to be. So we hope that through that we'll make something which is a facilitator of new types of knowledge production and something which is appropriate for this period of evolution of research and artistic practice. So that's probably too much about theory of science. Katiana was going to say something about some of the practical aspects.
Thanks so much, Tony, for taking us into the spheres of conceptual and theoretical framework. So I'm taking you down again, I hope a little bit deep down, more down than the practical level, into the Academy. So the Academy was initiated by Francesca and Daniela about a year ago. I think there was a presentation a year ago at Loppet about this, so I'm not going to give the vast general framework about placing now research and knowledge production at the core of TBA, at the core of the foundation. And right now the Academy is focusing on oceans. Eventually, you know, we may, or the Academy may go beyond the oceans, but because of one of its vehicle, which is the Dardanella, the research vessel, we are actually focusing on ocean subjects right now. So primarily, we are looking at one part of the world, which is the Mesoamerican reef. It's the second largest reef barrier in the world. It is actually quite unknown to the general public right now. It stretches from Honduras down to from Belize to Honduras, the other way around, and then into the sea, up to the Cayman Islands, in fact. And it's one of the most richest parts, I think, of the Atlantic Oceans, where you have hundreds of species, of new species to be discovered. Actually, Phil Lubell, who's going to speak later, is the specialist, the prime specialist on that part of the ocean. And we through Jana's work, we decided now to focus on coral reefs primarily, to focus with another artist. Tony has been working since at least a year or 1.5 years on whales and dolphins. We're going to perhaps focus on coastal communities, which is a project by Tommy, who's somewhere here. Tommy Brönel, there, exactly, sorry, behind you. Then we are venturing into a field which is more political, which is actually the laws of the sea, which to me is kind of the framework of all these projects, because, you know, without laws, you know, nothing is going to change on the side of conservation issues. So this would include marine reserves, which is another project we're trying to take on, which is quite important to us, is to create these marine reserves and to see what it does to the populations living along the coast, as well as what it does obviously to the species and the structure of the oceans. And this is a very interesting project actually because it illuminates another part of the Academy. So one part is obviously, as Tony explained, the transdisciplinary side to it, which means, you know, connecting art and science. The other part is the dissemination work, the awareness raising work, which is quite important to the foundation as well. So the marine reserves, as I said, is a prime example, which we would kind of work together with certain specific NGOs who are enabling state governments to create marine reserves and try to have at the same time, I mean, that's a very, you know, courageous part, but have some kind of educational impetus. I don't want to say program, but impetus in the sense of creating, for example, small movies that could be shown either on television with the BBC or at big meetings. We would like to at the same time have, you know, organized panels, symposia, etc., where we could, you know, present the artists' work who are working with us, together with scientists who will be working with us, together with conservation people and organizations. So one big part of that academy is not only to create works of art and works of science, but also really to enable these works to be shown to a larger audience, to a larger public. And that part of the academy, we are just starting now, is actually part of a larger TBA project to reach that audience through a blog, through the internet, which I'm not going to get into this one now here, but just to let you know. So there's this really larger framework. So there is, by the way, a little brochure on the table for if you want to have a look later on to see the general framework. I think I'm not going to say much more because I really want to see how our ideas are going to come into life through Phil and Jana later on. But I just want to tell you, before we are going to get into the discussion or into the conversation between Phil and Jana, there will be a statement by an Austrian scientist called Josef Penninger. He's the head of the IMBA, it's the Institute for Molecular Biology in Vienna in Austria, and he is one of the really prime geneticists in the world. He is very renowned, and he is currently, I mean, he obviously does zillions of things, but he has one idea to have a project with us on new species, on so-called extremophiles, which are bacteria who live in very, very hostile places, either, you know, in the sea near volcanoes or hypervents. And the idea would be to collect them, and then he would sequence them, and with that kind of sequencing you can actually find out many things about life itself, about, you know, genetics, etc., etc. So he's going to
start, can I put a question to you?
Sure.
As your impromptu moderator. The question I would have, I don't know if it's very nice. How do you do this? Can I borrow your one? It's not on. Is it on? Ah, it is on. Thank you. The question I have is, you both, you know, touched on the importance of the transdisciplinary aspects of this project, and you actually mentioned advocacy groups and reaching a broader audience. So essentially, you laid out the goals of how we are going to achieve this. I would like you to ask you, you know, because we've worked before on the morning line, for instance, and integrating different disciplines together. And, you know, we've experienced in the past a number of scientific projects that have, you know, invited artists to jump onto research vessels to go to Antarctic and various things, which basically fizzled out and nothing came out of it. Although, you know, Brian Eno and big names were suggested. So they sort of went along for the ride, and then it all fell flat. How do you see, with your guidance and us working together on this academy, can you make a difference there and make sure that the projects that are then coming out of the academy are not just a transdisciplinary exercise, but actually come together and fulfill all three of those missions, from the arts perspective, from the science perspective, and from the advocacy perspective?
That's fundamental to
And
what
the church bells perspective.
That's fundamental to what I was saying about transdisciplinary practice. The idea of doing something that's transgressive means that it should fall into these areas, into all of these areas. It's a very complex picture to produce something that works, you know, successfully in all domains, and I think inevitably there'll be projects that focus and are more or less successful in different areas. But I think as long as we are engaging and ensuring that projects are formulated and designed initially with all of these actors contributing, then that will follow. Well, maybe I should add to that. I think that missions like the ones you described haven't had any underlying philosophical infrastructure or credibility in terms of trying to address research questions. There's simply been, you know, let's take some artists to experience the Antarctic and let's see what comes out of that. It's not enough. You do have to engage with groups who are there. You do have to engage with scientists there. You do have to engage with people, not just fill a boat with Brian Eno and a few of his mates to go and make a tube.
But wouldn't you say that, like, when speaking to Phil, for instance, last night, I mean, his passion of the sea comes out in this incredible conversation that we had. And his experience is very broad and varied from many different, like, how many lives have you had actually? Just an old guy. And again, at the same time, we talked to Tommy, and he's passionate about this community that he has witnessed and seen change over a period of 10 years. So there's a natural sense of advocacy that's growing. Wouldn't you say that's the common thread? Because between life science and this world of oceanography, which clearly needs to communicate better to the larger public, and artists whose skill is communication and sharing, they need to sort of focus from being generally great composer or artist, but need to focus on, you know, adapting their medium into something that is a voice somehow, their voice, or a communal voice. But isn't the word advocacy something that can bring all of this together into a more powerful tool?
Yeah.
Because I'm sorry, and I would say my opinion, but you know, I'm just that's missing for me out of Novotny's transdisciplinary
It's inherent
writings. Yeah, it's how you put things together.
And I really think it can work on several levels, you know. So one, I mean, the ideal project obviously is the one which I hope is really going to work like this between Phil and Jana, where you have a common, you know, not only passion, not only advocacy, but also common interest in bioacoustics. So where both of them can contribute to the work of the other. Obviously this is not going to happen all the time, I suppose, you know, because it's very difficult. So let's say if you have a project which we may take forward with Josef, where it's until now mainly a science project, you know, where we still have to see what the foundation in terms of art or in terms of can actually bring to it, you know, or where, so I, you know, I think it will work on different levels, and you can obviously then, I mean, it's not going to be parallel all the time. Well, that's what I mean. So as you say, you know, the ground is that...
I have to disagree slightly here, because the first 2 times I met Joseph Penninger, he nagged me relentlessly about finding an artist for him to work with.
Yeah, sure. But
because he believes that the creative process that an artist goes through is very, very similar to the creative process of a very advanced scientist like himself. And he is a bit like the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland, you'll see in the film. But he, you know, he's like, trying to follow him and his train of thought is already quite difficult because he's so brilliant. But I think that on the contrary, this is where an opportunity to throw it out there. There's a number of artists here present, people that are involved in performance and in dance, in poetry. There are a number of different disciplines, documentation, so on. There are lots of people in this room. For that particular reason, we sit together, who should look at the Joseph Penninger's film and go, I'd like to get involved in that.
This is what I'm saying. So sometimes we will take it from that side
you have
or
to
that side.
encourage it. That's
exactly. No, of course, but that's
let's
the
listen
whole point.
to Joseph Penninger.
So let's go to Joseph, exactly.
Dana, you wanted to say something?
I just wonder if we should, because we've got quite a lot to get through, and I think if we can get into this debate when we've had contributions from
I think if they want to ask you specific questions, okay.
No, it was not really a question, it was just sort of saying something which was, you said, I will say something.
But I would like to say something maybe just very briefly. So what I was wondering about is how it would be possible to reintegrate the knowledge that you produce in a small project like this into bigger institutions, academic institutions, because I think there's an inherent paradox in actor-network theory and in what you said, and that is that institutions tend to institutionalize.
Yeah.
So if you put transgression at the core of your impulse to produce knowledge and you institutionalize transgression, it inevitably dies. So I mean, Transdisciplinarity has been around for 15 or 20 years, and everyone sort of, from an academic perspective, we desire it a lot, but only for a very small period of breakout, and then we sort of tend to usher back into into the rigid structures of the academy.
But what's fantastic about the opportunity that we have here is to establish a new type of institution. and we don't have anything to fall back on. This is what we have. So we're not going to suddenly go back to working within a traditional research council model or a art practice model, because we've never worked like that.